ready to join us. But I want to welcome you. My name is Jennifer Rittner. I'm an assistant professor of strategic design and management here at Parsons. I'm also an assistant dean for curriculum and learning. And you are attending Navigate. I have my notes here, just so you know, if I look to the side, it's not because I don't care about you, but because I'm reading. This is Navigating Change, Museums, Nonprofits, and the Future of Cultural Institutions. I think that many of us here are Parsons or New School affiliated, but actually, if you are coming here from outside of Parsons, really want to welcome you and so glad that you're here to join us to have this very important conversation. Let me give you an overview of our purpose here today and introduce you to our two guests. For decades, museums, philanthropies, nonprofits thrived under widespread public trust, government support, and cultural goodwill. Today, these institutions find themselves at the center of political attacks, internal pressure for reform, and a rapidly shifting cultural landscape. And that framing comes to us from our guest speaker, Sruthi Sadhujan, who is framing this conversation for us to think about the role that we play as designers and strategists in responding to these calls for change in this moment of intense scrutiny. The talk is also motivated by, in addition to this political and cultural moment, but is also motivated by a conversation Sruthi and I started a few years ago. She was writing a piece, an article that was published in the DMI Journal titled Treasures and Baggage, A New Way to Navigate Change. And I was really interested in the way she was reflecting on the challenges of what I would call radical decision making that nonprofits were being asked to confront, and are that continuation of this sort of demands for cultural or institutional change. The questions that she was asking that we're going to reflect on today is, what are the things that organizations need to hold on to maintain the integrity of their mission? But what are the things that they're willing to or in need of letting go of? What does it mean to let go of things that are holding them back? And also, how do they acknowledge the kind of fruits that are coming from, and this is Sruthi's wording here, the fruits or the illusions, the fruits that might actually, yield positive future benefits, and then the illusions that are maybe sort of moving them off mission or in directions that are not productive or helpful. So for me, this was an opportunity to bring Sruthi in to talk about this framework that she's developed for guiding organizations through change. And as I thought about who we would want to be in conversation with, I immediately thought about our colleague, Dr. Sharon Counts. So let me introduce the two of them to you. Dr. Sharon Counts is an artistic producer, designer, and researcher prioritizing equitable access to culture. She's worked extensively at the intersection of the arts, education, programming, and organizational design in the arts and cultural sector in New York City, including the New York City Center, Young Arts, Blue Man Group, and the Ride New York. Her research-led creative practice explores the efficacy of civic and community engagement programs in the arts, investigating how design interventions influence emerging trends in the cultural sector. And she is an assistant professor of business and design strategies and an associate director of the Masters of Strategic Design and Management program here at Parsons School of Design. So thank you, Sharon, for joining us for this
conversation. Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
And Sruthi Sadhujan is the founder of Studio S, a brand and strategy consultancy for nonprofits and mission-driven companies. She started her branding career at HyperAct, a nonprofit branding studio where she built and led the strategy team for about 10 years. Over the course of this time, she worked alongside leaders at the Ford Foundation, the New York Civil Liberties Union, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, along with other organizations, to help them find strategic clarity and redefine their roles in a world of shifting values and norms. And Sruthi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And in particular for doing it at a very, odd time. Sruthi is joining us from overseas. So we are really grateful that you could join us and make time in your evening to be
from old New York. I'm in Amsterdam.
Old New York. Since we're renaming places.
Old Amsterdam, yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's get started. And Sruthi, I'm going to ask you the first question because in initiating this conversation, much of what we talked about is how your experiences, your background kind of led you to thinking about this organizational framework. And I wonder if you can just share with us how you came to this work. What were some of the thoughts and the sort of the conceptual framework of, your approach to organizational change?
Yeah, I found myself in this space about 10 years ago at this point, and completely by accident. I spent a good portion of my mid-20s kind of floating around, not really sure where I belong or where my strengths are best put to use, but I stumbled across the world of brands, specifically in the social impact space 10 years ago. And, for a long time, I was just doing storytelling and UX strategy for websites and some campaigns here and there. Couple of years I put in the work and I started getting into brand strategy. And that was really interesting to me for a lot of different reasons because I have always liked like intellectual kind of big ideas and cultural conversations and trends. I also really liked writing, and brand strategy allowed me to bring those two things together. But then the more I started doing brand strategy, especially in the nonprofit space, I realized, this is more than just logos and taglines and mission statements and all of these things we generally associate with brand. It's actually a deeply transformative and sometimes even disruptive process for these organizations. So that naturally led me to start thinking about, how do I make sense of an intervention that comes in a very contained way, but then starts to seep into the organization and starts to affect the culture and the behavior and the power dynamics and all these things. And I have to say, when I came up with this particular framework, it was very personally influenced as well. Um, I'm a bi or multicultural person, I can say now that I've lived here for almost 8 years. But I've always
Hmm.
had one foot in Eastern culture and one foot in Western culture. I'm of South Asian origin, I'm Indian. And there are a lot of aspects of my culture that are at odds with each other. And I've had to kind of reconcile these competing factors as I've grown older. And I've realized, not everything traditional is bad, and not everything Western and progressive is good, at least for me. And I started articulating that in a framework that ultimately ended up being really relevant to change, navigating change in organizations as well as within individuals. And so that's kind of just a quick overview of how I landed here.
Thank you, Sruthi. Before I go on to Sharon, to Dr. Counts, I want to just pause and we've talked about your framework, but I would love for you to just walk us through what are these four components? What is this framework you've developed?
Yeah, the basic idea is that change is actually a lot of different component pieces that are woven together. And in order to be able to see it clearly, you have to be able to unravel it. And I'm proposing that we look at change through four different lenses. The first is treasures. So these are old ideas and traditions or ways of working that still hold value. Treasures are specifically useful. They're worth holding on to because there's wisdom there, there's knowledge, there's lessons, there's truths that have remained constant over a long period of time. On the other hand, on the side of the old, there's baggage. These are outdated ways of thinking or behaving that just no longer serve you as an individual or as an organization, and they're the things that must be let go of. Then on the other side, there are what do we want to embrace? And there are two different lenses of looking at things we want to embrace. The first is fruits. These are new ideas, ways of working, innovations that hold promise and opportunity. There's something emerging in them that's worth exploring. They represent genuine progress. And then on the flip side, there's an illusion, which is new ideas that feel exciting, but are probably a little deceptive, potentially harmful, not proven. They're kind of these sexy, seductive things that we want to chase after, but they may not hold up under scrutiny. So those are the four lenses has helped me a lot in just finding more nuance. And when I consider, yeah, change is a big word, but when I consider any sort of shift in the status quo.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Counts. I would love to bring you in and go back then to the question of what is bringing you to this work. And I think one way of thinking about it is many of us have had very formative experiences with nonprofits or cultural institutions that have actually informed our idea of their value and what they do bring in our relationships with them. And I wonder if you can reflect for us a little bit on your own background.
Sure. And also thank you so much for this space and this conversation. And Sruthi, your framing, I think, is enormously helpful for this conversation. I love this question because it has me thinking back to being a very young person. I feel like, my first experience with arts and culture was coming to New York City when I was 5 years old to see Annie, the musical, and that tipped off my second identity crisis as a child. The first one was wanting to be Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, and I have an old friend or two on this Zoom, so I think that they could attest to my forcing them to play different roles as I restaged those things as a child. But moving to New York City almost 29 years ago in September, I had the incredible pleasure and honor of working at Blue Man Group in its very early days. And Blue Man Group is situated across the street from the Public Theater. And when I was a teenager, I became obsessed with the musical A Chorus Line, how it was developed by the brilliant artist Michael Bennett and produced by Joseph Papp, the founder of the Public Theater. And when I arrived in New York City, I was sitting on the steps of Blue Man Group and I saw an incredible line of people very early in the morning, 8 a.m. in the morning, hundreds of people lined up around city blocks waiting for free tickets to Shakespeare in the Park. And that blew my mind, and gave me a deep insight into Joseph Papp's lens of making Shakespeare that was accessible to the people, his mandate around making Shakespeare free because Shakespeare belongs to the people. So bringing culture to the people, and being in New York City and seeing hundreds of people waiting out with their chairs and their coolers for the opportunity to see Shakespeare that evening in Central Park for free, really, really deeply struck a chord with me about how incredibly important it is for our arts and cultural institutions to use theater as a vehicle for conversation and change, and to make it accessible in every sense of what that word means. And that definitely fueled my passion for working in the arts and culture sector.
I wonder, the word accessible is such an important one. And so much of what we think about with nonprofit and cultural institutions is the ways in which they are intentionally accessible to specific audiences, but are also always looking to expand their reach. And I want to reflect on this tension that I think, when you talk about something like Blue Man Group or Broadway or a foundation, there's an inherent tension, I think, that I would love to reflect on about how you hold the core of your mission over long periods of time when the culture around you changes. So what are some of the challenges and tensions within organizations to both hold their mission, hold their core, and also respond to the times as they shift? Why don't I go to you first, Sharon, and then Sruthi? I would love for you to chime in.
Sure. I would say that the arts and culture sector, prior to this specific moment of challenges and wicked problems, as we said, has pre-existed. I mean, I think there's been a number of incredibly challenging infrastructure issues in the arts and culture sector that have to do with aging infrastructure, our leadership models, our business models, our membership models, organizational and aesthetic models. We have artistic and executive leadership of cultural institutions that have been in place for tens of decades, and without any kinds of constraints or models for changeover. And I think that the glaring issue that existed prior to 2020, which amplified this issue, is that the arts and culture sector has an inclusion problem. We are a sector that loves to talk about how we are a place for radical inclusivity, and we are, and yet There is a deep lack of diversity in the arts and culture sector, and that remains one of the most important issues that we're facing and we have to continue to face in the 21st century. So I think there are certainly new challenges and threats in this moment, but we are a sector that is riddled with an aging infrastructure, and that's something that has to be addressed regardless of the challenges of the moment.
Yeah, thank you. You know, you were looking at this as somebody who's worked within these institutions. Shruti, you know, I think that it's interesting for you to reflect on this as somebody who's been a consultant within the industry, right? So coming from a design and strategy space and coming into organizations, what have you heard around the tensions that they've faced before this moment? So let's put this moment, we'll put a pin in that
Before
because
this
we'll come back to
moment,
it,
yeah.
but before this moment.
You know, very much the same. I think a fundamental questioning of what is the role and value of these institutions, whether they're arts and culture, whether they're nonprofits or philanthropies. I experienced this firsthand when philanthropic organizations were going through this, were on the front lines of it. You know, it had already ramped up in 2018, but 2020 was a watershed moment. And, you know, we were asking ourselves really existential questions like, you know, if the money that these institutions are hoarding came from evil, evil actions, then why are they even being perpetuated over the next decade or so? You know, how can we do why do we why do we love to award companies for doing more good when we don't actually admonish them for doing less bad? Or why don't we actually incentivize them to do less bad? These are big existential questions, and yeah, I think it helps first and foremost to have to find the constant truth, that kernel of truth within your mission that can then be reinterpreted and redefined. Some organizations have that very clearly, and it's just a matter of redefining who are the people that we are trying to impact, how do we get to them, who are the voices that we're including in that process. Other organizations might find themselves in a truly existential moment. But I think being able to, going back to this framework, being able to really pull apart what are the practices that we have been holding up that have actually created harm. Where are the places where there may have been some good wrapped in there that we can still salvage? And how do we start to pull those things apart so that maybe the sum of all the things that we salvage and the sum of all the things that we embrace adds up to an institution that has essentially remade its promise to the public and its stakeholders?
Yeah. I'm going to take briefly kind of go into my own history. When in 1994 or maybe 1995, it's hard to remember back that far. But I was working at the New York Historical Society at a time when the museum itself had closed to the public. And they were going through what you're describing, which is really an existential crisis. And as part of that work, they were really reflecting on what their collections said about them, in addition to how they were interacting with the public and how their messaging had been traditionally intentionally about exclusion, that they were for and by a certain subset within, New York society. They were not really a museum for all. And part of the reflection they were doing is, what is our core? Like really questioning what their core was and whether the core itself needed to change. And that was not an easy transition. I mean, it went through several stages, including interventions by the state to stop them from, doing things that were actually going to cause irreparable harm, which included things like deaccessioning parts of their collection.
Mm.
And when they did come to a new core, the strengthening of that organization, its acts of inclusivity, which I see, you can see it in their programming, in their exhibitions, in their collections, even in just the way they talk to, and about themselves. It really shifted our understanding of our space, not just within the institution, I would say as a citizen within the institution, but also within the city, and how our history is reflected through that organization. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, why don't I go to Dr. Counts for this one? I'm going to keep going between your first name and your formal title, which is thinking about the kind of, these moments when these forces of change do bring you into existential crisis, what are the kinds of guardrails that need to be in place to prevent overreaction? Or what are some of the measures that you place around you to cocoon you while you're actually working through the goo of your existential crisis to get to the next stage? Do you have some examples you can share with us of where you've seen that happening?
Yeah, I think that in part it's around arming yourself with good information. I think that, as I speak about one of the arts and culture sector's biggest problems being inclusivity, I think it's kind of ironic that this current president in the United States has this war on diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And what he terms woke culture. And I think what's dangerous is how that is impacting federal funding and the landscape of the arts overall. Organizations across the country are now scrambling to address their organizational funding, the landscape that really can determine their potential future. So I think continuing to be a part of informational conversations, advocacy organizations like Americans for the Arts, and Theater Communication Group, who are doing a great job of sharing information in this moment, is incredibly important. I think it's really important to understand what executive orders do and what they do not do. I feel like, continuing to center that executive orders do direct federal operations, but they don't create laws or amend them, I think is an incredibly important factor. I think understanding that executive orders establish policies within executive authority, but they don't override or violate the Constitution of the United States is incredibly important to remember. Executive orders have been designed to respond to emergencies. This is not an emergency. The emergency is being created by executive orders. So I think continuing to understand the structure of the executive branch of our government is something that I would continue to center as something that's incredibly important for us to understand, and to understand how arts organizations, arts and cultural leaders can join forces. And I think a great example of that is this open letter from 16 attorney state generals that was put out pushing back on the mandate to disallow and disentangle organizations work through the lens of social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think it's incredibly important. And I think this is something that's a facet that came out of the pandemic that became incredibly important for the continued survival of arts and culture organizations, which is partnership, which is knowledge sharing, which is something that prior to 2020, I think was something that arts and culture organizations held a little bit closer to to themselves, their own special sauce. And I feel like out of that moment and this continued moment that we're in, where arts and culture is under fire, in terms of its continued relevance, I think continuing to join forces and to share information and knowledge, get centered in truth and fact, and then joining forces to figure out how you can affect change and how you can continue to survive in this moment is paramount.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you saying a lot of the things that we tell our, we talk about with students, which is the importance of forming community. And that's not just about individuals in community, but actually seeing the alliances among organizations, right? And so the strengthening of the industries or the fields or the sectors is because these organizations and institutions are maintaining relationship with one another, supporting one another, but also holding on to truth.
That's right.
Sruthi, I would love to pick up on this and this idea of truth, but with this very particular case that I'm thinking about, which is that, and I'm going to go to the sort of fruits and illusions within your framework here. When we talked about this a couple of years ago, one of your examples of a potential fruit is the renaming of things in order to form new forms of reality, to actually center different truths. And so the Audubon Society, going through this deep reflective exercise about what the name Audubon meant for them, was a really interesting way of thinking about organizational change through a rhetorical practice. What are the words that we're using to describe who we are? Now, we also have a moment where things are being renamed in a way that is perhaps reflective of an illusion. If we, certainly as I would articulate it, for example, the Gulf of America, which is the Gulf of Mexico. It is the Gulf of Mexico, but the idea of renaming it because of the right, a sort of political bias, prejudice, specific prejudice. And so, for example, the Nature Conservancy, in order to retain its funding, has had to change the language on their own website to reflect the government's recasting of this geopolitical body, the Gulf of Mexico, as the Gulf of America. So I wonder, in thinking about your framework and how you address truth, as Sharon is talking about, how do you address truth within this moment where the forces of change require, in order to survive, you actually have to adopt our version of truth, again, versus the Audubon Society, which was doing this. Well, I'll let you sort of talk it through, but in reflecting on this sort of idea of words, and the truths they hold.
Ooh, that's a big the word truth is just a scary concept these days because I don't know if other people feel it, but to me it feels sometimes less and less absolute and more slippery as, different groups are lobbying different versions of truths back and forth. I feel, fundamentally unanchored sometimes. So to me, I think in moments of crisis, um, I don't know if this is a controversial opinion, but I think in addition to anchoring to truth, it's incredibly important to anchor to your values, right? That serves as your personal guiding truth or your organization's truth in these moments. Um, yeah, I'm trying to go back to your question, which is, what is the role of words? I think in some cases, words are truly performative, and in that case, they are pure illusion because there's no substance to really hold them up. And I guess over time, we'll see if it holds up to scrutiny. I think in others situations, sometimes we can overcorrect for the power of words. And post 2020, I think there was a wave of renamings of public schools, for example, which I think there was value in. But at the same time, sometimes I wish the energy that went into renaming those institutions was also shared in making up for COVID learning loss that happened in those institutions. I do feel that sometimes what starts with substance and value can quickly morph into a performative practice and we lose track of what are we trying to achieve at the end of the day? Where is the tangible, concrete impact on the world? And I do think in that sense, the power of language, I see a great case to be made for it. I think language frames and contextualizes how we move through the world. But sometimes, actions count just as much. I don't know if I directly answered your question, but yeah,
Well, I
it's
would love,
complicated.
would you mind walking us a little bit through the Audubon example in particular? Because I think one of the things that you were kind of seeing in that example was the way in which the community was driving the conversations. And so can you tell us a little bit about that Audubon experience?
Yeah, so I was not personally involved in the Audubon societies. I think they went through a rebranding, but what had happened was it came to light that their founder, John Audubon, was a known slaveholder, and so there was a huge group of people who loudly advocated for the organization to be renamed. This was also in parallel to the organization programmatically trying to diversify the kinds of people that made up their community to really reach out to communities of color and get them involved in birding or to acknowledge the communities of color that already existed in birding. Um, I, as a consultant, I don't know if I would have an answer to this conundrum from the outside, but what I can say is, on the fruit side of the equation, there is absolutely value in obviously acknowledging the past and accounting for that and repairing for that through words. That means a lot to people. At the same time, as a brand person, I was considering the cost of changing the name of such a legacy institution. There is history and trust and real relationship that was built with that institution as it was known, the Audubon Society, amongst a wide variety of people. And so I think as an institution, they really had to weigh the costs and benefits of repairing the wrongs of their founder with potentially breaking the trust by reintroducing themselves as a completely new organization. I don't envy them that decision because that's not an easy one.
Yeah. Sharon, would you mind reflecting on that as well? That idea of legacy and the way in which words, but also mission, again, sort of looking at mission, the legacy of these institutions can either be a way of holding on to the richness, right, and the good that they've done, but also these moments when you have to ask, is this, again, sort of thinking through a baggage, is the legacy of this name enough of a benefit to all of who we hope to be, um, or how do we reflect on or create some method for moving into a new reality or a new future?
Yeah, I mean, big questions, and I do not think that a name change is emblematic of the kind of systemic change that is necessary to really bring about the change that we're talking about that we need to see in the arts and culture sector prior to this moment and moving forward. I think that, we saw a lot of kind of performative activism in the arts and culture sector in 2020 in the wake of everything coming to a halt, but also in light of the racial reckoning that happened in the summer of 2020. And I think that institutions across this country were changing mission statements, were creating diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, were adding artists of color and leaders of color to their staffs in sometimes meaningful ways and sometimes not. And in sometimes performative ways. So I feel like just changing a name isn't going to bring about the kind of change that we need. I think it's incredibly important and fundamental to an organization to have a name that is indicative of the kind of institution it is. In my doctoral research, I conducted a case study on an arts and culture organization in a predominantly Black city that had predominantly been a white-run cultural institution for its 60-year history. And at the time of my research, it had its second leader of color in 60 years. And there are a number of institutions that I can point to that have similar statistics. Oregon Shakespeare is another one. In 2019, Nataki Garrett became the first ever Black artistic director of Oregon Shakespeare. And while that is incredibly impactful and meaningful, Nataki Garrett also faced death threats for leading while Black. And it became a massive issue to the point where she had to have security detail, and the organization closed because of financial issues. And they, Nataki stepped down, and now they have reopened. So I don't know, would we point to that as a fruit of them kind of being able to reignite the organization, or not, in terms of having done what they thought was helpful and responding to the kinds of change that I feel like we want to see in the arts and culture sector beyond names and beyond performance, but having actual meaningful change, right?
Yeah, I wonder, there's this the performance of names. So I hear you. I'm gonna push a little bit on this
Yeah, please.
because I hear you. I think that the performance of names, the performance of language is a way of some occasionally of at times obfuscating and neglecting the deep systemic changes that are needed.
That's
At
right.
the same time, if you think about the ways in which words create mental models for our understanding of reality, words can be deeply meaningful and they can shape our
Mm,
sense of not only what's possible, but what's past.
sure.
And so, I think about the work that Deb Haaland, the former Department of Interior Secretary, did to rename thousands of sites around the United States that were using an ethnic slur
Yep.
against Indigenous people,
Yeah.
which I won't say the word here, but, thousands of sites that
Mm,
now are renamed to remove a slur. That's a meaningful change. And the language there,
absolutely.
right, is a reflection of history and of social realities.
Hmm.
And it's an intentional erasure of harm. So,
Yes.
so the language is meaningful. And you could say, if you want to stick just with the, in the topic of sort of indigenous realities, then, the renaming of, sporting teams and
Yep.
mascots and so on is not inconsequential. I wonder, though, in terms of strategic design and thinking about how we
Mm,
operate at different scales, how do we think about these scales of impact? So, at the scale of naming, there is right a sort of resonance to renaming that
sure.
captures something of the ethos and the culture and the inclusivity of an organization. That's very different from at the scale of the system, the systems themselves, the leadership and the operations and the relationships with communities. And so, how do you, when you think about strategic designers, let's go to our, sort of community here and strategists, what are the skills that they need in order to operate in this space where they are navigating matters of cultural change, naming, for example, matters of operational change? How
Yeah.
do we, right, sort of reframe and create sustainable, healthy institutions that can thrive? Um, what are some of the tools that you think they need and the skills that they need in order to be able to do this work?
Yeah, I think that the strategic design and management program is one that is creating these kinds of, creating these kinds of future leaders by endowing them with a variety of different kinds of tools driven by design ideologies that can be applied in a variety of different contexts. And I feel like speaking to your question, talking about larger change beyond naming, which can be incredibly fundamental to your point, and taking a look at the institutional mission. How can we continue to design systems, processes, and programs that allow for our arts and cultural institutions to continue to be as true to their cause as they say that they are in their mission? How can we lift up the value statements that they put on their websites and enact them with organizational design, with systemic design, with reorchestrating the business models of these organizations, which with rethinking whether or not the membership model, which is such a prevalent model in arts and cultural institutions, that is a huge part of the economic engine of arts and culture. How can we relook at that and redesign that to be more effective, to continue to create new streams of income and finance for our arts and cultural institutions? And I think that through the lens of design is an excellent way into taking a look at solving problems creatively by creating a lot of different kinds of possibility and not just coming to the table with one answer.
Yeah. Sruthi, I'm going to come to you because I would love for you to talk again as a consultant coming into spaces like this about the tensions that you have experienced within an organization that's asking for change and how they're managing or how you're managing the tensions among various stakeholders, which might include members of the board, members of the, the sort of executive team, people who are working within the institution, external stakeholders, and so on. How is it, what have you seen in terms of trying to manage some of those tensions?
Yeah, tensions are real and alive. There, I've again and again, I've encountered kind of two cohorts of people, the kind of old guard and the new guard, and they come in different flavors, but there are definitely individuals, various stakeholders who've either been in the sector or been in the organization for a very long time and are comfortable and convinced of the way things have always been done, Then there are those who are on the flip side who are maybe not necessarily always younger, but just more open to taking risks and open to trying new things and believe that forward is best and progress is best. And, going back to the way things were done is not necessarily the right way of doing things. So that I find these two constituencies always. There is no easy answer in these situations, but for me, the work as a brand strategist, and maybe also now I'm like increasingly calling myself maybe an org change strategist because the two are, intricately combined. Change starts and ends with people. And so to really understand the individuals, how they build into the organization itself, really understanding the fears, the hopes, the emotions at the center of this work can go a long way in just helping make sure that the change is more sticky and more sustainable. Doesn't mean that the change will be easier, but using people as like that most critical unit has always helped me. So curiosity, listening, conversations, facilitating, interviews, these tend to be my primary source of information. I then add on secondary research, but that direct firsthand understanding of what's going on in the organization is paramount.
All right, we're going to get into that because often we hear, oh, the soft skills. I don't care about the soft skills. I need the hard skills, right? But what you're talking about are soft skills because you're talking about listening, you're talking about presence, you're talking about being able to connect. And I wonder in particular, I want to look at that old guard because often those are the people in the institution, they have institutional memory, they're deeply committed. They are, as you said, sometimes they're really committed to what they know and they're not as willing to kind of move in new directions. But that means sometimes that means they're really holding your mission. And I wonder for you in thinking about, in particular, as a not to be ageist, but younger perhaps, right? In thinking about the role you play, designers can play when they come into spaces where people have deep legacy and institutional memory. What are the tools you use, or the methods, or the framework, or the philosophy approach that you use to work with these old guard stakeholders in a way that's both respectful, but with the intention of finding avenues for change? I imagine that is not a an easy navigation. So what are some of the things that you've seen there and how do you approach it?
I'm always surprised at how much an individual simply appreciates being listened to. Uh, in these legacy institutions, there aren't deep cultures of listening, of openness, of sharing institutional memory, sharing the emotions that naturally underpin the work.
Hmm.
And I have found as a outsider coming in, holding space for that dimension of conversation can open up just it opens up a different way of thinking. It may sometimes entrench them further, but more
Hmm.
often than not, I found that they start to see that there are nuances to their history. There are pieces that are worth letting go of. There's evolution that they're open to. So my biggest tool is simply asking really good questions. I know that sounds really trite, but these organizations don't have that culture. They have never been sat down and asked, what does this work mean to you? How do you construct your identity around your professional life? What are some of the defining moments of your last 20, 30 years? There are a lot of gems that we can then cobble together to create a renewed mission for the organization from individual stories. And I think it goes a long way simply to listen on a human level.
Sharon, I've got to bring you in on this because this is really core. And I think that, Sruthi said this sounds trite. I don't think this sounds trite. What's your experience been here?
Yeah, I don't think so either. My experience being a change management agent inside a large cultural institution, I would say, was incredibly hard work and risky and challenging. It's not work that I would take lightly or enter into without a strategic plan. So I feel like the strategy of launching a change effort, you have to have internal institutional knowledge of the institution, I think, in order to create an internal stakeholdership to buoy the change management effort so that you're able to think about it from every possible aspect.
Mm.
That was certainly the case for me when I launched a change management effort. And I think something that I learned along the way was that through change, we are also asking people, leaders who may be a part of the old guard, to give something up, to let go of something. And that is loss, right? So I think we have to go in with an understanding that we're asking people to make change that they might not want to make. Right. And that they will have to give something up in order to allow for this change to be possible. So I think approaching it with doing your best internally to break down the silos that are inherent to organizations, both inside arts and culture and outside of arts and culture, is incredibly important to build up a coalition of understanding and also to invite people into the process so that you are not a one-person band going in with banging your big drum about making change, right? I feel like we need to be thinking about change making inside our institutions from the landscape of funding, from the landscape of marketing, from the landscape of leadership, from the aesthetic vantage point, right? We have to really be thinking about these things from a variety of different vantage points to allow for the possibility of change to occur in the context of whatever organization it is that might appeal to a leader who is a part of the old guard, whose predominant methodology is this is the way we've always done it,
Right,
right?
right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the word loss really struck me as being critical to this because I think
Yeah.
we're experiencing something of an anticipation or anxiety around loss. But I
Mm-hmm.
think what you're also saying is that all change requires loss. And so how, again, do we prepare ourselves for that? How do we help other people prepare for loss? And
Right.
again, when we think about the kind of soft skills that are required here, the ability to ask insightful questions, but also to be present, to acknowledge the feelings that people have around loss, perhaps is also a way of helping them then transition to the future. I wonder, we can talk a little bit about some of the challenges of this particular moment as we are all facing anxieties around loss. But I wonder if I can flip it for a moment and ask, what are some of the hopes that you harbor for the future of nonprofits and cultural institutions? What are some of the strengths that exist within these sectors right now that you think will keep them alive, that will buoy them through the next several years? I'm going to leave that open to whoever wants to jump into that one.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
I will jump in. I feel like a part of this moment for me is really intentionally cultivating a practice of hope. And I feel like I have a number of students on the screen who know that I am bringing them into that conversation because they are a great source of hope to me. These incredible emergent minds who are the people that are going to go out into the field to do this work. They are the hope. I think too of the incredible transgender poet Andrea Gibson, who said recently that we have to create. It's the only thing louder than destruction. And that really resonated with me. And I think that, arts and culture organizations will continue to dig into our identity around the role that we play in society, that we have always played and that we will continue to play. The arts and culture sector is not going anywhere despite this current moment and dictums coming from our government about funding. I think more and more arts and cultural institutions are doing a wonderful job of partnering, knowledge sharing, sharing resources to speak with one voice as a united sector. So I think that's something positive and hopeful that's coming out of this moment. And I think that arts and cultural institutions are being faced with making some change within their own structures that I think are helping them to continue to gather evidence of their economic impact of their work and to their societal impact of their work. So I think there are some good things coming out of this to continue to provide and to put together the kinds of evidence that we need to challenge the negative assumptions about arts and culture's place in society.
Yeah, thank you. Sruthi, I'm going to go to you, but I'm going to pause you for 1 second while I just say that I think part of Sharon's and my mission is to get more and more students interested in the nonprofit sector
Yeah.
and to really feel committed to working in those spaces, but to do it with deep knowledge and understanding. And so not to think that designers can go in and change those organizations, but to really be the ones who are doing the deep listening and hearing really all of what you just described, and then also being the ones who can sort of help create the guardrails and the kind of frameworks and the directions that will help them to continue to sustain their work and to thrive. Sruthi, what do you think? What's hope?
What is giving me hope? Sharon, what you said kind of reminds me of this idea that through destruction there is rebirth. And that was
Yes.
kind of that was the framing of this whole conversation, that for a long time, our civil sector, nonprofits, philanthropies, arts and culture had this broad societal kind of permission space to do what they will. They had our goodwill. We considered them to be these beneficent organizations. Somewhere along the way, I do feel like a lot of them lost their way. They started resting on their laurels. And the bright side of this extremely dark situation is that in feeling this existential threat, I really hope and do believe that these organizations can fundamentally get back in touch with their founding values, or that core mandate that sprung them to life to begin with, and to really reinvigorate their promise to whichever groups of people they serve. So I hope that through this immense pressure, something more constructive and more valuable to our society is born.
I love that when this goes back to your framework, and I think the idea of this as a self-diagnostic tool, that it's actually asking not necessarily in the act of explicit change, but as a way of reflecting on where your organization is, where it has been, where you think it's going, as a tool for thinking about sustainable, the sort of sustainability of an organization, that this tool is a way of doing this work internally. And to have somebody, I think, the sort of facilitating that, who doesn't have a particular bias within the organization, but who can ask these really reflective and deep questions, right? What are you holding on to? What does it mean to let go of things? What does that loss feel like? What does it do to either strengthen or make more vulnerable the core of your mission? And I think that is an invitation for all of us that are operating within institutions to do that kind of constant reflection, right? It's not just when you're facing a major existential crisis. It's actually a way of thinking about your sort of institutional hygiene, if you will. Before we leave, I don't see any questions in the chat, but are there questions or comments that anybody in our audience has? Or even do you want to ask a question of each other before we depart? Kush actually has a question. Kush.
Hello, hi, I'm Kush. I'm a first year STM student, and I also run a nonprofit called Space Pride, which is for international LGBTQ plus folks in the aerospace sector. So we are quite a young organization, and I've only been doing this for 2 years. So the conversation was really helpful. But the question I had was, sometimes, like a lot of times, we've run into institutional barriers, like people preventing us from participating in like conferences, or people preventing us from participating in like bigger dialogues in those conferences, like meetings, etc. So as a small organization, how do you balance like working around those institutional barriers and finding other initiatives to, or other ways to focus your impact? Or standing up and actually challenging those institutional barriers. I feel like that kind of a balance is very important, and it's also like hard for me to get and sort of navigate. I would love to know your thoughts.
Is that to both of us?
I think so. Yeah. Would you like
Yeah.
to start? Sure.
You go first, Sharon.
Oh, sure. I think it's a massive question. Obviously, I think that Shruti and I will both have, I hope, helpful perspective to offer. I think that being involved in the arts and culture sector means that you have to be an arts activist. I think that is part and parcel with being in the arts in any facet or running a cultural not-for-profit. So I think aligning yourself with the institutions and infrastructure that already exist and the location that you're doing the work is enormously helpful. There is a ton, and especially in New York City, there's a ton of arts advocacy organizations. There are national ones too that will continue to arm you with necessary information, because I think that's what you need to have in your toolkit is the actual data, the information that you can bring to the table when you're coming up against naysayers or people that don't value the work that you're doing or are being discriminatory or are keeping people at bay. Again, in a sector where we love to espouse that we are most inclusive, right? So I feel like challenging that with fact, with truth, with information, with data will continue to arm you in part with what you need to continue to push back on those kinds of ideas. What do you think, Shruti?
Yeah, you're doing very important work, first and foremost. I would encourage you to build coalitions with other smaller up and coming groups. There's always power in numbers, and if you want to stand up against some of these entrenched power dynamics, I think it would be particularly helpful to show up in force. So find, values aligned, smaller organizations who would be willing to join forces with you. And together, I think you can create a much bigger impact, or at least make, inroads into some of these entrenched institutions or conversations that you're trying to get into.
Thank you very much. We have one last question. I'm sorry that we didn't take more questions. I should have stopped earlier. But David Marquez, what different approaches have y'all, thank you, David, to leaders, wait, hold on. I went to it's moving, seen be more successful for different sized nonprofits, especially in a New York City context?
Ooh. I think that's a great question. I feel like a huge part of what I did as an arts leader at City Center was to build knowledge sharing relationships with a wide variety of arts and cultural institutions around New York City. And one of the most foundational and important ones that I built was with the Public Theater. And the CEO of the Public Theater, who is somebody that I worked with almost 30 years ago at Blue Man Group, right? So as you continue to build your networks in New York City, you can then leverage them to the ability of the organization that you're working for. And I feel like Patrick opened doors to me that helped me build City Center's first ever touring and production program. Because of the lens of the financial lens and the leadership lens that Patrick holds and the kind of work that they do. So I feel like continuing to build relationships, I feel like, as Shruti was saying, relationship building, coalition building, and sharing information and knowledge, contacts, resources, opportunities for funding, is something that is going to be paramount to the continued success of smaller organizations and institutions, right? These partnerships are already existing. And I feel like we're going to be looking to our foundations more and more for their involvement in the funding beyond the federal landscape in this moment to also continue to buoy our smaller institutions.
Sweet, did you want the last word here?
Sure. Yeah, David, I'm not 100% sure of the context of your question, but I'll do my best to answer it. In my experience, having worked with small to large organizations, the large ones they necessarily have to expand to do a lot of different things. There's just a level of, quote unquote, professionalization that happens. So large nonprofits are doing some research, doing some advocacy, doing some grant making, doing all the things. I think the opportunity for smaller up and coming organizations is to have a niche and to have a very specific focus. If you have an issue, then have a very specific intervention within that issue. Do something very well rather than trying to do all of the things. I think in choosing a very specific and narrow positioning, you will accumulate wisdom and knowledge and expertise much faster, and you'll be able to prove your value to bigger and bigger organizations who you may want to partner with. So if you have a very specific expertise and experience in one lane, then that makes you more interesting for conversations, for alliances, for funding in the future. So making sure that you have, a valuable positioning to hang your hat on.
Thank you so much. I know that there are a couple more questions coming through the chat, which we cannot answer now simply because we have to stop. But may I ask, Sruthi, would you be willing to have some of these questions directed to you? Would you want to
Sure.
provide your email address? And if you do, you could put it in the chat. And Dr. Sharon Counts, you can do so as well for anybody who does not know how to get in touch with you. Thank you all for joining us today. Sruthi, Sadhujan, and Dr. Sharon Counts, thank you so much for your insights. And I hope that we will continue having these conversations because they are necessary and we are all in it. We are all affected by what's happening right now. So thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye,
you both.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.